You can find his thoughtful journalism about Energy's future at energi.media. That's ENERGI.media. It's Markham Hislop.
Well, you had me on when we published part 1 of the Unethical Oil series, and now we published part 2, which is about conventional oil and gas liabilities and how Alberta got into the mess and how big the mess is and what the chances are that Alberta is going to ever dig itself out of the mess, or is the Alberta taxpayer going to have to, basically pay for, tens of billions and maybe well over 100 billion to clean up this mess.
Let's get started. So what does part 2, where does part 2 kick off?
Production in Alberta has been around, for over 100 years. And really, Alberta started regulating in about 1938, with the formation of the first regulator. The question is, when you have an oil and gas well, sooner or later they all are depleted and they have to be reclaimed. By law, you have to clean them up, and the well site has to be plugged and sealed, and then you have to reclaim the well site. There's this great letter in 1995 where the regulator is, of course, it's an internal audience, so the regulator is frank, and it says, this is kind of what we thought was going to happen. Boy, were we wrong. This is really point. You've had Mark Doran of the Polluter Pay Foundation.
He's in our chat right now. Yeah,
he is. And Mark makes the point that this is the moment when the industry accepted responsibility for all oil and gas environmental liabilities in the province, whether they assumed the collective responsibility. And this eventually led to what we now know as the Orphan Well Association. The problem is, between then and now, the problem has become, gigantic.
We've seen different estimates, right? I talked to Minister Guilbeault just a while ago, and he's into the $100 billion range. Some have estimated as high as $300 billion. I know that you at Energi Media have stuck to sort of 130 to 150 billion or so. Are you surprised that with people sounding the alarm, like yourself, other advocates, like you say, Mark Doran, Reagan Boychuk, they've obviously been very prominent. Alberta Views magazine has reported on this, as have other mainstream media outlets, that generally speaking, and I'm just putting my finger on the pulse here, the general public doesn't seem to care? Are you a little surprised?
No. Disturbed, worried. Let's back up. The last interview that you did, we talked about capture. So there's regulatory capture, where the industry captures the regulator, and the regulator begins to think that the corporate interest is the public interest, confuses the two. Well, there's also cultural capture. And Alberta is a lot like I've worked in the industry in Oklahoma and Texas, where, people are so identified with oil and gas that if you attack oil and gas, it's like attacking their own identity. And pollster Janet Brown out of Calgary, I'm pretty sure you've had Janet on your show,
yep.
Has done polling on this. And it's very clear that Albertans are so identified with oil and gas that more than 50% of them, according to Janet's numbers, if you attack oil and gas, you're attacking them. So they're already, the bulk of the Alberta public is so pro-oil and gas, they don't want to hear this issue. And that's the danger of Premier Danielle Smith's R-Star program. It got shelved. Remember, she didn't want to talk about it during the election campaign. No, that's off the table now.
Is there any reason for optimism? Is there something that could turn the tide? Do you have one takeaway from folks that right now might just be feeling a bit of a gut punch over all of this?
Well, there's two options here. It's not as if the Alberta government doesn't have options. Okay, its political will is lacking. But in part 2, I talk about two options that have been put forward. One of them is Mark Doran's, where he basically says all the pieces of the puzzle are in law. Companies are required to reclaim. In law, they are collectively responsible for all of the liabilities. All the government has to do is enforce the law. And in fairness to Danielle Smith and UCP, in 2020, they brought in this new liability management framework. And then in 2022, they brought in the inventory reduction program, where now we have mandatory spending. So last year was 600 million. In 2027, it'll be $992 million. Drop in the bucket, but nevertheless, we've got that. Government could say, hey, you know what, guys? Next year it's going to be $5 billion. And then it's going to be $5 billion for the next 10 years or 20 years, and you're going to get this whole mess cleaned up. There are plenty of wells that maybe aren't at the beginning of their life, their economic life, but they're still making enough revenue that they could be taken from the private companies, put into this reclamation trust, and instead of paying back shareholders and paying, that the profits would go to starting to reclaim these liabilities. So again, now you can imagine if a UCP government, a conservative government, proposed, hey, you know what, we're going to expropriate oil wells and other facilities and infrastructure in order to pay down your debts. I mean, heads would explode in Alberta. So you can imagine what kind of a political hullabaloo that would create.